going to overcome the deficit. We're just going to discuss for 1.5 hours about the issue. So you should rest assured on that, actually. We were supposed to have 4 papers, but our colleague from India hasn't been able to make it. So we shall have 3 papers. One by Dr. Naomi Hussain, who is at the Department of Development Studies at SOAS, University of London, UK. Her paper is Political Legitimacy and the Development Contract in Bangladesh. The second paper is by Dr. Mirza Hassan of BIGD, BRAC University. His paper title is Further Consolidation of Dominant Party State in Bangladesh, Implications for Democracy and Capitalist Development. And the third paper is by Dr. Zulfan Tajuddin, who is from the Western Sydney University in Australia. His paper title is Democracy and Development in Indonesia, a Reflection. We also have 3 distinguished discussants. Dr. Mushtaq Khan, who is a professor of economics at SOAS, University of London. Dr. M. Associate Pro Vice Chancellor Research, University of Bath, UK. We have started late, but the organizers have assured us that the allotted time will be given to us, which is 90 minutes. As per the. So we'll divide the 90 minutes into 12 minutes per paper and 8 minutes for each discussant. Then we'll have some time for Q&A, and then we'll conclude. So I'll request the presenter to be strict about their time. And without further ado, we'll request Dr. Naomi Hussain to get going with her paper. And the time is 11:24, so up to 11:36.
Thank you so much. I'll do my best in my 12 minutes. And everyone can hear me, I think. Is that right? So thank you very much for letting me come to your very interesting conference. It was a last-minute thing. I didn't know it was happening, but I'm really excited to be here and to get to speak to all of you very brilliant people. And in fact, I'm taking this opportunity to talk about some ideas I've been working on with a colleague at the University of Manchester, Professor David Hume. He and I actually have a full paper. There's a full paper that goes with this. But I think neither of us are entirely sure about it. And so really, I think one of the reasons I've brought these ideas to you today is to test them with the people who would be best placed really to say whether these ideas are any good or not. And essentially, really what I would like to pick your brains on in this room is, and obviously Professor Mushtaq Khan, I could ask him back in SOAS given that we are in the same university, but here he's going to be able to crucify me in a public stage on these questions. But I have some questions for you. Well, I'd really like your help with answering them. And essentially, the main question is there what we might call a development contract in Bangladesh? And by that I mean, is there an agreement that Bangladeshi governments, partly because of the uniquely disastrous features of our early political history, do those governments earn their political legitimacy substantially through development performance? And I'm going to talk a bit about how I believe this to be the case. I think it feels right. We talk about it in a kind of regular sort of way, as though there is a kind of a contract around development. But I think it was initially grounded in a commitment to protect against crises of life and livelihood, disasters and food insecurity in particular. But that it maybe latterly evolved into an emphasis on growth, infrastructure alongside some public services. So my question for you people here today is, was there ever such a thing as a development contract governing politics in Bangladesh? How did it work, if there was one? And does it still work? Does it still exist? So I'm just going to briefly go over some ideas, some arguments, some frameworks that we often use when talking about the politics of development, and talk about why I think the development contract may answer some of those questions. Look at a few of the key turning points in Bangladesh's development history that give rise to the idea of a development contract, but which may also suggest it's no longer very functional, and then to unpack in a bit more detail the elements of this supposed development contract, which you will, at the end of this session, let me know whether it works or not. So one concept that's very familiar now, I think, is the Bangladesh paradox, and it's this idea that Bangladesh has done quite well developmentally, especially economic development, to some degree social development, but it has done so with what is called in, I guess, good governance, or bad governance, essentially. Weak governance, but economic development is the nub of the Bangladesh paradox, I think, is the idea. And I think I and others have long wanted to unpack this further and understand whether in fact the governance of Bangladesh, the politics of governance, have actually been dysfunctional for growth. And I think obviously Mushtaq Bhai has done the most of anyone to really challenge those associations that good growth must come from good politics or democratic politics and so on. We also use this language of the development success and the Bangladesh surprise. I think Dr. Asadullah and Professor Wahiduddin and colleagues wrote some very nice work on the Bangladesh surprise, which I think I really buy. I think it really, the idea that there is a surprise in that Bangladesh's development was not only relatively high growth, but also kind of inclusive, that it really did, on the whole, reach really the poorest of the most marginalized communities, the people who are least likely to benefit from growth. So there is a kind of a surprise there. We are accustomed to thinking about this, I think, in Bangladesh. But what are the explanations for why Bangladesh managed to deliver good development with poor, weak governance? I think one of the concepts that I have used in my work has been the social contract, and I think we're all familiar from our, political theory classes from, undergraduate days, that is the idea that people consent to be ruled so that they can enjoy collective protection and social order. But it's not been a very popular concept in contemporary political theory, in politics and development. It's had people challenge it. They say, oh, this is a kind of liberal theory of, all these, equal citizens getting to choose who governs them, who rules them, and it's not realistic. And it has been challenged, though, quite successfully, I think, by wonderful work by Carol Pateman on the sexual contract, that says, we're not all equal in the contract. Women are subordinate to men. And by Charles Mills, who's written about the racial contract and says, actually, there can be a social contract, an agreement to consent to be ruled, which is not equal. We can be in that contract and yet be dominated by the terms of the contract. And I think those two ideas really did help me think, yes, we can use this concept of the social contract in Bangladesh without it being a perfect liberal egalitarian contract. Yes, we recognize there is domination. We can be in a contract which does not necessarily empower us equally. And I think that one of the interesting things about post-colonial nations like Bangladesh is that it is possible in the moment of the constitution, the establishment of a constitution, to see something very like the origins of a social contract. So it's perhaps a metaphor more than a theory, but it kind of works. There are other concepts that have been doing the rounds to explain these things recently. The idea of elite consensus, which draws a lot on my earlier work on elite perceptions of poverty, which says that Bangladeshi elites had a lot of agreed on essentially the rules of development for a very long time. Stefan Durkon's recently written a book with quite a lot of material from Bangladesh about elite bargains, saying elites gambled on particular arrangements around growth and development in Bangladesh, and that was one of the reasons they succeeded. And of course, there's the very, I think, pervasive concept of political settlements, which I probably won't try to explain in this room for reasons many of you will understand. But essentially, we're talking about here arrangements of elite power on which development outcomes really do depend, who's in power and how they hold on to that power. I use these concepts to come to the idea of what I originally called a subsistence crisis contract, which is such a mouthful, I now decided it must be the development contract. And this social contract is not the same as the social contract you'll find in Rousseau or Hobbes, because it's very much an internationalized contract. It reflects Bangladesh's integration into the global system. The contract is not only between the masses and the elites of Bangladesh, but also the international community. Maybe aid donors is the wrong word these days, international community. And the substance of that contract, in my view, is that the elites agree that they will protect people against the worst disasters and the worst food crises. It's a contract to protect against subsistence crises, essentially. And there are a number of turning points in Bangladeshi history which I have used in my work to argue this case. The Bhola cyclone is the first. Well, actually, you could probably go back to 1943 and the famine there. But I haven't done in my work, but it is possible to go back that far to look at the ways in which particular crises have set the terms of a contract and then tested them again. The Bhola cyclone in 1970, I think we all know, was a massive disaster. Between a third and a half a million people perished, and the Pakistani government did nothing and entirely lost any remaining legitimacy it might have had. The cyclone was then politicized very successfully by Maulana Bashani and by Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who, and when the Awami League won the election in 1970, which immediately followed on the heels of the cyclone. Oh, I do beg your pardon. What happened to my, oh, there we are. Yeah, thank you. At the end of the, he won what the Awami League won what was described as one of the most stunning democratic electoral victories ever. There was the 1974 famine, which I've also written quite extensively about, which in my view really did reset the terms of the development contract in Bangladesh and drew attention to the plight of the rural people, the women, the very poor, the landless. And after that famine, Bangladeshi food security policies, agricultural policies, social protection policies have never been the same again. There have been other turning points, which in my view turned out to be false turning points. I learned a lot about the development contract in 2008 when we asked some researchers I was working with, we asked policymakers why it was that Bangladesh so successfully managed the 2008 food crisis. And they looked at us in shock and they said, because of the famine. They explained that it's because people had learned, the Bangladeshi state had learned after the famine that it was essential to keep prices reasonable, to keep prices stable. And this really led me into a study of the famine at that time. So it was a turning point for me, not for the country. The Rana Plaza disaster, another false turning point. It should have been a turning point when workers' rights should finally have really been taken very seriously, but it shows that the power of the industrial elites in this country really is overwhelming against even the relatively increasingly organized power of the workers. So that did not reaffirm the development contract as far as industrial workers have gone. I will skip those two and just say a few things about this, what I think this is, and whether you agree or not, I'll be interested to know. I think the unique nature of the development contract in Bangladesh is founded in Bangladesh's very unique vulnerability to climate and global economic shocks, going back to our very founding history. And this has led to certain principles of state practice, a protection, a kind of hardwired commitment to protect against shocks, and the idea that the legitimacy of the state, the legitimacy of the ruling party rests very much on efforts to protect against those shocks, that there are specific practices that we can all recognize, and that this really needs to be reaffirmed for each generation. It needs to be shown through political commitment to the most vulnerable. Free markets will never deliver protection against these shocks. I think now we're in a situation in Bangladesh with the dominant political settlement, dominant party settlement, where we have quite a lot of responsiveness, but not a great deal of accountability. And that is an important feature of a social contract, is being held accountable for failures or commitment to the contract. So where will this go in the future? I think that I think we're increasingly seeing that the trajectories of development progress with cheap labor, that development model is wearing thin. It's not delivering the kinds of inclusive middle income growth that we need. We are likely to have to respond even more to global crises. They'll be more frequent, they'll be more serious, there's no doubt about that. Can the development contract deliver on that? And finally, I would refer to some work I've been doing with Dr. Mirza Hassan and Selina Aziz and other colleagues who are not in this room about the feedback state. We're hearing certain kinds of reforms of the Bangladeshi state, administrative reforms, participatory reforms, particularly since COVID, which suggests to us maybe the Bangladeshi state is finding new ways of listening to its citizens. So maybe that will have an impact. So I will leave it there, and I will just remind you what my questions were. Is there such a thing as a development contract? Was it ever there? How did it work? And does it still work? And I'd love to know your views on these things. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Naam Hussain. Wonderful. Just 1 minute extra, which is allowed, actually. Dr. Mirza Hassan now, which is...
How do I get out from this? Need help? Okay. No one to help me? Just escape? Presentation to...
Anyone from the organizers in the room? There needs to be someone from the organizers in the room.
Aja, Ahmed, this is number 2. Yeah, all right.
Okay.
You have to go to him? Right, right. Okay. All right. My savior. Okay. Thank you, Chair. I'm going to talk about politics. Okay, and it might sound like a little bit of politician. As you can see, the title is Dominant Party State and Further Consolidation and the Consequence for Democracy. The printed thing said that I'm going to talk about capitalist development, but I'm not going to because of the time constraint. All right. So there are lots of fancy technical definition of what is dominant party state, but to put it in a very simple language, whereby one party calls the shot in all domains of state, political, and civil society. In the Bangladesh case, that would also include the state itself, including the constitutional bodies. There are 2 variants of dominant party state. The democratic variants, India during the Congress rule, and so on. Japan, or some people say Japan is still a dominant party state. South Africa would be one. And there are authoritarian variants like Singapore, like previous Malaysia, Rwanda, and Bangladesh will be part of that as an authoritarian variant. And why do we say party state? So it's a de facto party state. It's not a one-party state. Is it Bangladesh? I'm talking about Bangladesh now. The reason is that the partyarchy, where party dominates the entire political and civil society process, that's what partyarchy is. And that partyarchy actually overwhelmed the incipient polyarchy that we have. Polyarchy, as defined here, political order that is highly inclusive and extensively open to the public contestation. For historical contingent reason, so partyarchy took over. So we never could develop the polyarchy. And that's one of the major reasons that we failed to develop, minimalist democracy in Bangladesh. Okay. And historically, it was inevitable. When Bangladesh was liberated, there was only one party. So it came naturally that we had this, the dominant party state. And then I've done some counting over the last 50 years. The DPS actually dominated for 26 years. And the competitive party system, the so-called, I would say, this bit of an illusion in between 1991 and 2006 when, elections were governed by caretaker government. That's for 17 years, and we have direct martial law for 9 years. But I would say the CPS, the competitive party system, was formal legal rather than actual. In that sense, because the party system relied on the third-party enforcement, for regime succession, never incentive compatible to the ruling party, thus not self-enforcing, consequently abandoned. And so what we had is the alternative patriarchal monopolies, bereft of any functional polyarchy. So that's what we had over those years. And in that sense, if I am right in terms of CPS being actually DPS, in that sense, the DPS is 43 years in Bangladesh. So why am I doing this accounting? Because the analytical significance of this is that DPS is a centripetal force in Bangladesh. Political elites' strategic incentives tend to align with it, thus they tend to gravitate towards that is that the DPS is a self-enforcing equilibrium. And it is a politically efficient focal point, if you think it from the game theory perspective, the coordinator, holding the political order in a robust manner. Its efficiency as well as primordial form of citizens' loyalty that it enjoys have also been reinforced by successive political dynasties, another highly robust and resilient form of focal point in the POs. In fact, I would rank the political dynasty as the most important focal point. So DPS turned out to be a comfort zone for successive regime, since it enabled regimes to manage electoral uncertainty and enable the colonization of the potential challenges from the constitutional bodies and civil society. Fault lines, the trajectory now after post-election, there are two, national and international. The national is the major opposition party. The ruling party thought, the opposition will go away, after all those, political engineering and so on, but it cannot be just whisked away. That's what we have found out. The other one is the international, which is a little bit of new development in Bangladesh in politics, per se, is the geopolitics, okay? So the main negotiation, main bargaining of the ruling party in Bangladesh from now probably will be dealing with navigating the problems of, geopolitics rather than internal, because the internal opposition will not be able to mount any effective opposition thanks to the DPS, the coherence of the DPS, and thanks to the family-centric political capital that two parties enjoy. So I think I've covered that. After successful navigation of the labyrinth of the geopolitics, this particular DPS, the current DPS, have become highly confident and emboldened. But the geopolitics is a shifting landscape. Okay, so it cannot be taken for granted. What we have now may not last that long. So it has to be a continuous process of negotiation and renegotiation. So what kind of, so typically in the DPS, the dominant party system or state, or in the one-party state like China, they want to experiment, different kinds of representative democracy, participatory democracy, because they have the incentive to do it. In the absence of democratic legitimacy, they would go for, the developmental legitimacy or, performance legitimacy. So they tend to do, innovation. Like in China, they have, different kinds of experiment down the line, especially at the local level. So one could expect that, similar thing would happen in Bangladesh in future. That's a prospect. And there are deliberative forums, there are, invited space where one could expect that, to derive political legitimacy or developmental legitimacy, they would go for that. But if China is a lesson, then those local forms of participation or deliberation and all will be orderly political party, under control, constrained, within a limit. And the leash over civil society will be lengthened or loosened contingent on the possible consolidation of the DPS over time. In terms of the political fallout that we are witnessing is that, the epistemic community, the intelligence, the media, the middle class, There is a deepening of this patriarchal control over the NGOs, and will become risk averse, and a new subjectivity of the middle class might emerge, more conformist, more apathetic.
4 minutes.
Okay. So, if China, Vietnam, and many other countries, or Singapore, if they are the historical lessons, there will be demand for more meritocracy from the professional class, from the state administration, and so on, and social stability. Social stability should be guaranteed, and that would be one of the expectations, not liberal democracy per se. In the non-elite domain, with the popular classes, there is an enduring social contract, and I would say it's a Hobbesian. Okay, so I'll give you what I say. The demand from the popular classes is essentially positive freedom. Socioeconomic demand, socioeconomic rights, and so on. And there's a lower salience of negative freedom, which are essentially the liberal rights. What states should not do, and the positive freedom is what states should do to enhance my freedom and capability. So in that sense, the performance legitimacy will depend to what extent state can offer this kind of performance, better performance, and security of food and other socioeconomic needs. So this is a good opportunity for a DPS like in Bangladesh. It's a propitious conditions that instead of democratic legitimacy, let me just supply the performance legitimacy, the development legitimacy. That's easier. That's easier. So to what extent the current DPS will exploit it, use more creative use of it, we'll see in the future. Fate accompli. I'm a bit of sympathetic. It's politically incorrect to say these kind of things, but I'm a bit of sympathetic that we have to live with this. If we have to live with this, then we should think of other forms of democratic imaginaries, such as direct democracy, deliberative democracies, however smaller in the decentralized form, to ensure some degree of accountability of the state. So mobilizing around the invited spaces where the state offers participatory democracy, participatory forum, like we have in the rural the context, because these experiment citizens' engagement at the periphery are less threatening to the rulers. So they will have incentive compatibility to do that. Plus it helps with the performance legitimacy. So it's a virtuous cycle in that sense. So another thing that we hope will happen is this building and strengthening of collective forums to the popular classes. This is, I don't know, state will offer it. Rana Plaza is one thing that state is definitely not in favor of the interest of the working class. So the working class or the popular class will have to fight for it. And one of the agenda of progressive politics would be how to develop this kind of associations, collective associations of the popular classes in the formal and in the informal sector. I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Again, thank you for keeping to the time. So we have a third paper today, and that's on democracy and development in Indonesia, a reflection, and that I invite Dr. Zulfar Tajuddin from Western Sydney University, Australia. 12 minutes for you too, but 1 extra minute for being a external. You are, of course, internal, being.
I think I need help here, how to find the file. Can I get help?
This is a bit embarrassing.
Yeah.
One performance deficit that we're witnessing in real time.
And then?
ফোল্ডারগুলো কোথায়? We need presentation folder. I'm not sure where it is.
Sorry?
I'm not sure where the presentations are.
Can the timekeeper,
Here.
One second.
This one. Number 3. Okay.
Yeah.
excuse me,
Yeah.
can you just
we
go
got
out and
Yeah,
get
yeah, this
someone
one.
from the
Perfect.
organizers?
Yeah, we
Thank
got
you.
it. We got it.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay, they have got it.
Please share this screen.
They have got it.
Yeah.
We'll file a complaint with the dominant party state on this issue.
Or shall I share from this machine, or you can do that one from your side? Or probably I have to share from here. Let me do. Oh. No. Okay, let me try. 1 second, 1 second. Yeah, yeah. Okay, 1 second, 1 second. And then
Go to the Zoom.
this is the file.
International conference
Share.
Okay, and then
Very much, Professor, for
what should I do now? I do now the slideshow.
Right. We can just slideshow.
Yeah, this one.
That's good.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Sorry for the hiccups. I'm Zulfan Tajuddin from Western Sydney University. My first trip to Bangladesh, my first trip to South Asia. Really excited. I teach at Western Sydney University, but I'm from Indonesia. So a lot of similarities. And my paper today is basically about temptations for authoritarian growth. I'm not talking about Bangladesh. So if you will find some relevance, that should not be my mistake. I'm talking about Indonesia and probably the relevance of that kind of trend, especially in Asia. So let me start with what is called the Lee thesis. This is named after or proposed by former Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, probably the best benevolent dictator that the world has seen in the past century, dreamed by many in the developing world. And I can see that one in my country, and I'm sure that you will find also in this room or in Bangladesh. So basically, this is the temptations for authoritarian growth. And why we need to discuss this one, remember that we are, as we learned from yesterday, that the whole world now is in the period of democratic backsliding. Democracy has been declining in the most affluent countries in the world. And also, basically this one, if you are a poor country, you need discipline, you don't need democracy. Democracy will just create noise. That will create chaos in the society. So you have to discipline them and then you develop. Where the best way to find this kind of thing? We go to Singapore. Singapore is the best way to find this kind of idea and has been proven by Lee Kuan Yew during his lifetime and up until now. But not only Singapore. Let's look at what happened in Chiang Kai-shek, Taiwan, Park Chung-hee, South Korea, and also Mahathir Mohamad, Malaysia. Some resonance of that kind of idea. But the problem is, this kind of success story is very selective. And this choice, or this kind of hope, this is the argument that I'm going to make, is very risky. So if you hope for Lee Kuan Yew, you may get Mobutu. If you want for Park Chung-hee, you may get Idi Amin. You ask for Mahathir, you get Marcos. So who will guarantee? So the risk of failure is way bigger than the risk of success. So we are talking about probabilities. And not only that, look at, I quote here 2 studies, more than 10 years ago, by Michael T. Rock and Carl Knudsen. And the Lee hypothesis, even in Asia, if we do systematic tests, systematic means systematic, not anecdotal. Lee thesis does not pass systematic tests. So that's what we know so far. Now, let's look at what happened in the past. I refer here to 3 tragic cases of how authoritarian growth ended with collapse and disintegrations in the 3 cases. Soviet Union between 1930s to 60s, Pakistan's Ayub Khan's era in the 1960s. It was praised by the international community as a development success story. I remember that in my class, development studies class, it was said that Pakistan was the model for South Korea to develop in the 1960s. And also Suharto's Indonesia, my own country, for 3 decades of long-term growth with all the achievement, part of the East Asian economic miracle. So in those 3 cases, what happened? That happened with the same fate. High growth followed by economic collapse and political disintegrations of the country. That's happened in Soviet Union, happened in Pakistan, Pakistan becoming 2, Pakistan and Bangladesh. And then we have Indonesia, and remember that East Timor now is a new country called Timor-Leste, was the last province of Indonesia, incorporated only in 1970s, but seceded from the country in 1999, just 1 year after the Asian crisis, 1 year after the collapse of Suharto. Now, this is the fault lines of the authoritarian growth. That's the risk. So what we can see here, that kind of authoritarian growth seems not sustainable. What we want is something sustainable. That's the path. So the idea is we have to go back to one of the best minds from Bangladesh or from Bengali world, Amartya Sen. We are not asking about whether the country is ready for democracy, but we need to think of how a country will fit through democracy. I think this is a very noble idea. So if we want to link this one with the previous literature on growth theory, probably we can link this one. Democracy in the world of Michael Porter is innovations-driven growth rather than factor-driven growth. So authoritarian growth could be good in the face of factor-driven growth. But democracy will fail to initiate innovations-driven growth. Innovations will come out from freedom, from opportunities, from contradictions. That's where we can hope for innovations. So I remember that the 3 steps of advancement proposed by Michael Porter is quite old literature, by the way. So that's probably one of the way we make it relevant with the development theory. The second one is from Paul Krugman. This is about differentiating between this is the critique of Paul Krugman on East Asian miracle. Perspirations and inspirations. So instead of perspirations, the economy should opt for inspirations. And inspirations can be driven by freedom. And that's the good thing, the intrinsic value of democracy, rather than just use democracy as instrument. And then let's go to Indonesia now. What happened in Indonesia? So yes, Indonesia experienced the hardest hit country in Asian crisis. The hardest hit country in Asian crisis. But this is again, blessing in disguise. The crisis triggered democratic transitions. And no one's sure about the trajectory of democratic transitions, and the country was within the specter of Balkanizations of Southeast Asia, but the country survived. And then actually, that democratic transitions actually saved the country from total disintegrations. That's one lesson learned from democracy. The second one is, If you look at the two world major crises after the Asian crisis, we have the global financial crisis just 1 decade after the Asian crisis, and then we have a decade later, we have also the COVID crisis. Let's look at what happened in Indonesia. The country survived. Let's show you the data. This is the growth trajectory in the three crises in three largest Southeast Asian countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Philippines. And you look at in Asian crisis, more than 13% economic contractions. You look at Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and you look at what happened during global financial crisis, during COVID. The country survived. One reason, one argument that we can use to explain is the country has developed a kind of, yes, this is imperfect, democratic institutions that has the legitimacy, and then they can handle the crisis very well. So this is to argue for if you want to differentiate between, in Indonesia, during the Suharto, it was the authoritarian growth, and after Suharto, since the year of 2000, after the recovery from the Asian crisis up until now, let's call it as a democratic growth. So the argument is democratic growth probably lower than the authoritarian growth, but democratic growth will be more stable. And democratic growth should be good for innovations-driven growth and inspirations-driven growth. How that will happen in Indonesia in the future, only time will tell. Look at this one, the indicator of democracy in those four countries. Since the year of 2000, you can see there, Indonesian score of democracy based on the VDEM, Liberal Democracy Index, consistently higher than those three countries: Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand, the largest four countries in Southeast Asia. Now, let's look at the cause of the crisis, the breakdown of the authoritarian growth. The red line is the actual GDP of Indonesia. And let's make the projections had the Asian crisis did not happen. And then the trajectory of the previous growth continue. Where Indonesia will be now. You can see that 20 years later, the country will be at the level of twice of the current real GDP. Can you imagine? If the country now is at $4,500 per capita income per year, it means that if you follow the GDP potential, that will be around 8,000. Amazing, right? So that's the cause of the breakdown of the authoritarian growth. And then what we can see here, the damage is permanent. No way for the country to recover that one. You look at the trajectory of the red line, and you can project how good will be the the democratic growth, and then where it could be compared to the lost opportunities. Now, this is my second last slide. What about the attractions to China's model? What I would say is, no, I'm very aware of this kind of attractions, especially in the developing world, especially in Asia. And probably China is the next best example after Singapore for the so-called Lee thesis. Now, I want to say that this is too early to conclude. And I'm not favoring that one. I'm not rejecting that one. I don't know. So let me share my initial insight. Why it is too early? Let's look at Soviet Union. It took 50 years to see the stress in the Soviet Union economy. And then eventually, the Union collapsed. And then, this is something that we don't know, but I came across this kind of very interesting book by Daniel Bell, The China Model. So China may have internal check and balances within the country. They have what is called the political meritocracy. Only the best and the brightest could lead the country, run and we can witness from the performance or the speech by the Chinese ambassador yesterday. I'm really impressed by the way the ambassador representing the country internationally. I'm really impressed about the confidence, the eloquence, and the clear point that he made yesterday. So this is one note. And then, of course, Singapore also adopt what is called the meritocratic system. So I'm aware of this one, but too early to tell. The last one, we go back into the conclusions. We should contradict democracy and development. We should dichotomize democracy and development if we want to go back to Sand's hypothesis that a country will fit through democracy because of the intrinsic value of democracy. So, because now, I don't think now if we are looking around the world, the choice for authoritarian growth is there, but it is very risky. I think this will have a lot of relevance for many countries in Asia and including Bangladesh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zulfan. That was an excellent presentation. So we come to the close of the papers, and now we will hear from our review panel. I'll start by asking Professor M.M. Akash to provide his comments from there. 8 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will make my comments covering all the 3 papers in general terms. So my argument will proceed in general terms. First of all, I want to point out what is democracy is now controversial. How do you define democracy? But actually, Amartya Sen's definition, democracy is ruling through public discussion. We can start from there. Then it must have 3 dimensions. First, the participation of people or public, in whatever way you define it, in the decision-making process. Not only vote, not only political competition, but actually the role of the people in the major decisions which determine their fate. So this is the fundamental condition of democracy, that I can influence my luck or my results or my what I get through my own opinions and participation in the process of governance and other things, social, economic, political, cultural processes. If that ideal definition we accept, then democratic deficit will be there in all society which are class divided and which are ruled by a ruling class which is separated from the people and which try to govern from the top, not from the bottom. Now, if given this paradigm or given this type of structure, the essential question boils down whether development is possible with less democracy or more democracy. And that answer is nuanced. You cannot say that always improvement in people's participation will give you a better result. Or you cannot say always decline in people's participation will give you bad results. Because the forms of institutions and the mechanism inside those institutions can have various types. And that's why you have come to a modernization thesis that some countries are not yet ready for democracy. They will have to develop first. Then they will, when they will be more aware of innovation-driven growth, first they will be driven by factor-extensive growth. And then after a while, when that will be exhausted, then only the time of democracy will come. That's how now it is explained. And there is the Lee hypothesis that until then, a person like Lee can deliver the developmental goods and continue. And from that perspective, one can argue that one-party state as Mirza argued, one-party state in Bangladesh may lead to a Lee hypothesis or may lead to a Marcos hypothesis. So there lies the uncertainty, and there lies the main question, to which it will lead. Yesterday, Mushtaq was telling, for Bangladesh case, that even with Awami League dominance in the top, if it can develop bottom organizations which can be performance-oriented, in the language of Mirza, then it can go ahead or continue ahead with democracy deficit. I am interpreting it in that way, but maybe it is not that way, not so easy. The vertical, he explained that if the vertical control is more democratic or gives, vertical control is assured. If vertical control is assured, that means you take a developmental policy from the top and you implement it through your mechanism, and nobody can deviate from that. If anybody deviates from that, he gets a punishment. That means some kind of accountability and transparency is there, although vote and other things may not be there, or may not be, there is a parliamentary democracy where there is opposition and to bilateral party system and other things. Those things may not be there, or by using the Western criteria, you can say democracy is not there. But in terms of developmental performance, in terms of actual delivery of goods, food security and other things to the people, it works, if that is so, Now, in case of Bangladesh, what will be the fate of Bangladesh, whether it will be able to develop a developmental state or it will degenerate into neither democracy nor development. That is the main question, I think. My hunch is this, that if, as Mirza has suggested, at the bottom, organizations of people, real people, not organizations like political parties which are now competing with each other, who are not actually representing people, I think. They are run by an oligarchy belonging to the same class. So that's why the class which is outside both the parties, if those classes, for example, the Bangladesh paradox, you say that Bangladesh is showing a paradox despite democracy deficit, and you identify it with growth, infant mortality and other things. But actually it is not a paradox. It was done by four forces, four driving forces behind that. One is the migrant laborer who were able to send enough remittance. One was the garment sector, which somehow, because of certain policies and the accidental war in Ceylon, it got the market space and developed. And thirdly, the SMEs, the small and medium sectors. And finally, the best, I think, is the agriculture sector, which gave you the food and other security. So these people are not yet the dominant driver of the dominant political party. If these people can be incorporated in the ruling mechanism and have their voice, then the productive force will grow and also the distribution will be more equal. And that can only save Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Akash. I'll now invite Professor Joe Devine for his remarks.
I'll try and be brief. I think, so the whole session is under this idea of democratic deficit. And I think we should stop talking about deficits. It's a subtractivist epistemology. It'll take us nowhere. Yeah, because we'll either say we're not, there's something missing to get us to the West, or there's something missing that doesn't allow us to get to the Lee thesis. There'll always be something that's missing. That's what deficit thinking makes us do. And I would rather that when we think about democracies, because I also don't like, we've obviously seen today through very good presentations that, just using a single word, democracy, to explain a whole myriad of political arrangements. So let's talk about democracies. And in order to fully understand that, I think we have to get more into the skin of what's happening in Bangladesh and worry less about deficit. To start seeing the values that Bangladesh is trying to create around the deficit, around the democracy that it's trying to create. So that would be my first thing. Let's not talk about deficits. I was surprised, but I liked Mirzan's very careful word, a dominant political party, not one party. Yeah. And what it reminded me of, I used to be 18 years of age, and then I was dominant at football. I'm now no longer 18 years of age, and believe me, I'm not dominant in any sporting activity. So dominance comes and goes. And as our last speaker also said, you look at the Soviet Union, you look at China, these things change quite a lot. You look at my own country. If you want a deficit in democracy, come to Britain. I'll show you deficits in abundance. Okay? So it is dominant, but these things will change and do change all the time. And it doesn't surprise me, therefore, that in a room like this, under this kind of topic, A, it's full, and B, that it's got quite a lot of people who are much younger than me, because I think it's something that we should be thinking about constantly. Where, as I said yesterday, where does society want to go in Bangladesh and why? And I think that's the questions that we've been trying to do. So some very quick comments about it. When we talk about political settlements, when we talk about social contracts or development contracts, we tend always to look at these things from one side of the contract, the state, and what it might do in order to keep the rest of us happy, in inverted commas. And I think that that kind of thinking is important, but going forward, what I would really like to see is much more exploration of the other part of the contract and what they're thinking and doing. So society. And I'm not sure we know in Bangladesh really what society wants from whatever contract is made with the government or with the state. So Mirzan said that we're moving towards something which is apathetic. Is it just disquiet? Well, if that is the case, and it's an if question, then I think it's up to us as researchers to try and understand better what is it that society would like from the contract that it enters, and then we'll worry about the name of it. I'll be the first to have a go at Naomi's question about development contract. My initial response would be, is development such an important thing to society in Bangladesh? Again, in the United Kingdom, development is a non-entity. It's a no question. We're not interested at all as a society. Some people are. So is development strong enough to hold a contract with the state? I don't know the answer to it in Bangladesh. But if I look at the development trajectory of Bangladesh, I would say that I think it's done more than just perform very well. It's been more than performance legitimacy. It's actually done very well. So whether or not that's going to be strong enough to hold a contract, I don't know. I don't know if people are interested enough, the majority of the population, and then I don't know if it's strong enough to hold it. When Naomi first said this idea of a development contract, what came immediately to my head was, I would really like to see in the future Bangladesh where the idea of something like a social policy regime was much more embedded, properly funded and functioning. So in other words, you've got things like tax going in to pay for systems that allow us to have health, the education, etc. that we want. And in one ways, development has been guilty of moving away from a social policy regime idea to something which is endless, discrete, short-term projects. So that's just my immediate reaction. I'm sure when Naomi says she's been thinking about something for a long time, it's very well thought through. So there's my immediate reaction. On Mirza's paper, what really struck me was his timing of things, and it made me sit back, because basically what he's saying, I think, was from 1991 to about 2006, that was anomalous. The rest of it is the normal. Yeah? And in a way, we had a meeting recently with some colleagues in Brack, and Naomi was there when we were talking about civil society. And I said something similar, which, you know, the whole civil society, NGO, the NGO bubble in Bangladesh, roughly the same period of time, it seems to everyone from outside that it was quite anomalous. So it's quite interesting that these two things are coming together in a way that then will make us rewrite and rethink that part of history in a particular way, if it's true. So, the main point, I think, what I'm trying to get back to is, what is it that society would want from a contract? And what would hold that contract together, knowing that it will change over time? I'm not sure that development would do it, but again, I think it's incumbent in us to think through and to try and explore what that might be. And that takes us to some of the discussion that might be around accountability, and I've only got one very small comment to make about that. For the best part, when I hear people talk about accountability in Bangladesh, it ends up being a question about poor people having to make the state accountable. And I think that's a cop-out. If anyone is going to make any state accountable in any society, it's not poor people. It's the general mass of the population. And therefore I worry when Mirzan says, oh, we might be apathetic. And I suspect we might be apathetic, some of us. I'll put myself first so that I'm the first one to be taken down. Partly because we're getting the benefits from the same apathy. So I think there's also a kind of a call in there to think about accountability. And let's, not focus on or put all the burden of accountability on poor people in development projects, but to see it much more as a societal project where we're asking the state to be accountable for the actions that it does. Having said all of that, I go back to what I said about my own country, because I come from one of the most thinly veiled democracies in the world, where our own society is very weak at making our own state accountable. So let's turn the deficit question around. I think the way that Bangladesh sometimes asks questions about these big problems, I wish in my own country we would be asking, or we would have the same energy to ask the same questions. So keep going with the questions, keep the energy behind the questions, and in many ways, you're much further ahead, I think, than many countries that I know and have visited. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Joe Devine. We have our third commentator, Dr. Mushtaq Khan, 12:25, so you know the time.
Thank you. I think these are really very, very big questions, and 8 minutes is going to be short. I'm going to respond as quickly as possible. I think the first issue is that we need to make a distinction between democracy as a set of normative values. You talked about Amartya Sen, and I think that in that sense, clearly, we are all, I think, Democrats. We would like to live in a society where public discussion and participation informs the kind of society we live in. There's a separate question of how do political systems actually perform. And, I think that the ruling party in Bangladesh would say we are a democracy. So the question is, how does democracy in Bangladesh perform relative to alternatives? Here, I think that we had some really interesting papers. And to be just upfront, I completely agree with the last speaker, Professor Tajuddin. I think that everything that is going on now, and I'll put myself up front and up for criticism, I think that this is not a sustainable system and it's not going to end well. So here I disagree with Mirza, and I'm going to outline why I'm saying so, because I think it's a really controversial position, and all of us are making predictions which might turn out to be wrong, because the future no one knows. But here is how I'm thinking about the issue. To me, the framing of political economy that I use is to look at the distribution of organizational power in a society. And I call that a political settlement. And organizations are really important. Organizations are parties, organizations are firms, organizations are informal networks, organizations are kinship networks. These are all organizations. And that distribution of power and capabilities determines what kinds of decision-making checks and balances operate. Because actually to operate an economy, you need to have checks and balances, and you have to have decision-making capacity, okay? Now, Naomi talked about a social contract, I think, and you said it's a metaphor, and I think it's a metaphor. Societies never sit together and make a contract. They never have a pact. Even elites don't sit together and have a pact. So I think that metaphor is sometimes counterproductive in terms of forcing us to think, was there a contract? Did it change? How did it change? What is changing is the distribution of power. And that distribution of power changes because new forces organize, but also because economies are changing. So if I compare Bangladesh in the 1990s and 2000s with today, two things have changed. Political organizations have changed and economic organizations have changed. Political organizations have changed because at that time, we had two big coalitions, both of them client list, one under the BNP, one under the Awami League, which managed to organize large numbers of people with the fundamental and the basic, they were basically rent-capturing organizations. Okay, so let's not beat around the bush. The differences in ideology were minimal, actually, when you look at the details of it. But they were powerful enough to check each other, and neither party believed, really, that they could be in power forever, although they tried their best to do that. Now, so the contract really is that they did not think they could totally outwit the other. So they didn't go too far in trying to do that because they understood the consequences of doing that. There was a check and balance. The economy also was much more broad-based at that time, because at that time the driving force was the garments industry, which was at that time not so politically connected, not sitting in parliament, and they were not that powerful, and there was a check and balance between them. So what we call the democratic period in Bangladesh actually reflects a broad distribution of power. And what has happened since then is that one of the parties has completely outwitted the other party and basically dismantled it. And they could do it for a variety of reasons, including ideology. And a lot of kind of progressive middle-class people believed that the BNP was a threat to secular values and to religious neutrality, and which I think was an exaggerated story, right? Personally, I think it was an exaggerated story, but BNP totally failed in countering that narrative. BNP failed. And because it failed in countering the narrative, it lost the educated middle class support. It also lost the battle in the regional geopolitics, which we all know about. And those things allowed one party to dismantle the other party. So that changed the distribution of power. The second thing that changed was that economic power became more consolidated in Bangladesh, as in many other countries. If you look at India today, there are two big business groups, the Adanis and the Ambanis, and it is not a surprise that Indian democracy has become very authoritarian, because it means that a political party which can bring into its fold 3 or 4 big businesses can dominate the economy. The Adanis by themselves supply 80% of India's solar power. Can you believe it? I mean, the Adanis and the Ambanis together dominate the Indian economy. It's an economy 10 times our size. A similar thing is happening in Bangladesh. A few big businesses are all that you need to shift the distribution of power to one side. This is new. The question is, so where I would slightly disagree with my friend Mirza, is that I think the dominant party is not the equilibrium. Actually, the dominant party has to be created with a lot of effort. And it has to be created with a lot of effort because it's excluded lots of people from the distribution of the spoils. This is why I think it's actually quite a vulnerable system, But there is another vulnerability to this system. And that is the nature of the ruling party. And I really like Professor Tajuddin when he said that let's be selective in our examples. So Mirza talked about Rwanda and Singapore, China, Malaysia, etc. Are these really organizational structures that are comparable to Bangladesh? I think not, for one fundamental reason, is the nature of the political organizations. The nature of the political organization is completely different. Why is Singapore and China meritocratic? They're meritocratic because their political structures are organized in such a way that the top layers of the political structure can discipline the bottom layers of the political structure. This is what my friend Akash was saying, I was saying yesterday in the plenary session, is that those societies which have, in quotes, authoritarianism, but are developmental, have a lot of vertical enforcement power. That vertical enforcement power comes from having highly disciplined and organized parties. Now, do we have highly disciplined and organized parties in Bangladesh? Of any? I doubt it. Which is why no party can claim to be meritocratic. Because even if the higher authority knows that someone lower down is absolutely incompetent, they can't actually remove that person. If someone in authority knows that this businessman is ripping banks and not repaying it, they find it very difficult to stop it. Can that happen in China? Can that happen in Singapore? So what does it tell us about the distribution of power inside the party? It tells us that actually the party is not very strong. And so the dominant party is kept together with a lot of ad hoc activities, which makes it very vulnerable, which makes the leadership very short-termist, and this is very different. So I think that if I look at the potential delivery of the developmental results in Bangladesh, I am not sanguine, I am not optimistic. No new industries have emerged in the last 20 years, right? What has happened is a massive infrastructure boom, and I was explaining yesterday why that happened, and I'm not going to repeat it, but this infrastructure boom might leave us with a lot of unsustainable debt. And that unsustainable debt is emerging now. To solve this problem, you actually need a very strong leadership which can address some very hard problems which are caused by powerful people who are within its fold. They know it. Can they address it? This is the challenge. Now, this is where prediction becomes implausible. My question is, it will only deliver developmental success if it surprises us by being able to discipline its own supporters. I will be surprised if they can do it, because that is not how these parties are constructed. But they have to do it. If they are not able to do it, there will not be a developmental delivery. And then Professor Tajuddin's prediction will be correct. We will have some kind now. Whether this will happen in 1 year or 10 years, we don't know. These growth stories can last for 20 years. But the fundamental problem is there is an issue here about the distribution of power, which has changed in a way that has allowed one group to dominate. It's not a stable equilibrium, but it's also not developmental. And I think that opens us to the question of what is the response of civil society, of intellectuals, and so on. And here I'm going to be even more controversial. I'm going to say the only answer is we have to develop alternative organizations which can challenge and put pressure on the ruling party to start delivering, or maybe even to take power one day. But I think that in a place like Bangladesh, relying on one dominant party to deliver is not a good idea. Even if we support the Awami League, and many of us support the Awami League, it is good for the Awami League to have real contestation from an alternative organization which has an alternative agenda. And I don't think this is from a normative perspective. So I started with this, right? You can say from a normative perspective, democracy is better. It may or may not be. But I'm saying from an economic perspective, from a developmental perspective, given the structure of hierarchical power in our societies, a Chinese type or a Singapore type or even a Rwandan type authoritarian one-party state is not possible in Bangladesh. However much Awami League tries, it will not be able to construct that kind of party. So having that check and balance is important to make sure that we have a good enough governance. I am a big critic of good governance. I'm a big critic of this idea that you can impose Western-style governance here. But we have to have developmental governance based on checks and balances. And those checks and balances have to come from what can be loosely called democracy. But I agree with Joe. We should not get stuck up about these definitions of deficits and so on. But if we can agree that some form of political competition and contestation is what we mean by democracy, then I would say that is good not only normatively, but from a developmental perspective.
Thank you.
So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mushtaq, for those bold evaluations. We've been informed that we don't have too much of time. So, nevertheless, I think we are talking of democracy, and if we don't have a Q&A segment in this, then I think we are not really practicing what we are preaching. So we will have a Q&A, but it has to be very short. I'll just take 3 questions or comments of 2 minutes duration each. So, and we'll be democratic. Whoever raises their hand first will be recognized first. One there. Let me just, let's be democratic. This side one. Anyone this side? Here. 2, and someone at the back, and Badul Alam. Okay, 3. So please go ahead. First, and a mic to, if not, why don't you just go up there and quickly, give the mic there actually. 2 minutes, otherwise lunch will be forfeited.
I think just building on where Professor Mushtaq Khan left. So can Bangladesh continue the surprise? I think the investment in infrastructure, no matter how much corruption was there, it had some benefits, right? I think one solution for Bangladesh to sustain is to be export focused. As you said, if we can create new industries, I think that could sort of create new rents, because we are not even where Indonesia or Thailand is. So I think, do you think that for elites, a focus on export, complete focus on export next few years could somehow like compensate for a lot of the problems that you were saying?
Thank you. Here. If you can give it here.
Thank you. Sorry, I come from India, and you can imagine how important this discussion is for us. But I would like to pose this question. In this struggle for sustaining democracy, there are other players who are important. There's media, there are mass movements, movements of peasants and workers who sort of with their feet defend democracy, students. Now, what ensures that they can battle this out effectively? And how has that experience been in all the countries that we've been talking about?
Thank you.
Thank you for very provocative discussions. And I have just simple question to both Professor Mushtaq Khan and Joe Devine. They talked about the civil society. I represent the civil society, and I wasn't sure what they are referring to. We know a lot of civil societies have leashes behind us, and we run organizations, so we are not free agent totally. So I'd like to hear from you that what really you wanted to say about civil society. What can civil society do, and how can we restructure ourselves?
Thank you. Since they have been very disciplined, we'll take one more question, just behind. Pichane, AJ, Pichane.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I mean, the categorization of the transitioning of the power and the influence into the politics. Dr. Mushtaq and Joe Devine, you talked about the civil society. How much we are developmentally fit, considering long history of Bangladesh nation? We have so many things. So is there anything from your research or observation that development fit criteria Bangladesh population can meet to have a very harmonious transition of this power and make a democratic deficit to overcome over the period? Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, they won't be able to answer this, but you can surely talk to them over lunch. So, as chair, I'll just make some concluding remarks, and that will be the end of the session. I'll be going there. All right. Very important in democracy that actors have to assert their rights in appropriate way. So as chair, I have to assert that right of trying to give some closing remarks. Kake? Kake? Na, okay, so I think, as I said, we are not really solving the actual problem of overcoming democratic deficit here. We are just discussing about it, which is a very important starting point for anything. And I think I really want to thank the richness of the papers they touched upon. They came at it from various angles, and really want to also thank our friend from Indonesia, from Australia actually, but of Indonesian origin, also to give that larger perspective. And the three commentators, they also actually extended the boundary of the discussion. And I think for me, what was very striking is that certainly there has been an attempt at being predictive. And I think that predictive ambition has been questioned also, meaning what will happen to the current situation, the dominant party state, for example, the current dominant party, will it continue, will it endure, what will be the future? So there has been some ambition about being predictive. And I think that was also appropriately questioned from other angles. I think, particularly from our friend from Indonesia, and also Mushtaq, I think, highlighted that, it's so important to be also factual. We can always be in this, our framing world of concepts, ideas, etc., contract, developmental state, etc., etc. But it's so important to be factual. Even this premise of Bangladesh surprise or paradox, that was actually a formulation by some academics. Down the line, there will be questions. Does it stand up to an actual empirical scrutiny? 90s was the period was told about poor governance. It was also the period in which the most deep banking reforms took place. The connectivity reforms took place. So the empirical record of governance, of development, of democracy and democratic deficit, it is so important to get the empirical record right. Because we can be, looking at one part of the elephant and describing that. It's so important that at this point in time, we are talking of democratic deficit, and we have moved on to, type of developmental state, etc. But has democratic deficit, if we want to call it that, in Bangladesh, has it also led to a massive performance deficit? One can ask that question now. And it's again so important to be empirical here. Looking at, when you say the growth story, where does Bangladesh economy stand today? It's so important to be empirical. What is the income distribution? Even poverty statistics, the most recent poverty data, is bringing into question the whole concept of poverty as we understood it, and reintroducing the idea of vulnerability as a much larger concept. which explains the economic status of so many people, not just the poor, the middle class also. So it's very important for us to be appropriately empirical here. I think that's very important, whether we are doing the economic analysis, the developmental analysis, or even the political analysis. Even the political analysis, I think we really had a very rich discussion about unpacking the political process in terms of the party structures, what is driving them. For example, one can pose a question, pushing Mushtaq's conclusion a little. Is the Awami League, does it continue to be a party? Does it have in that sense, a strong party base? Or is it essentially riding on the state structure? Does it have really a power base, but not necessarily a party base in that sense? So one can really pose those questions. And Bangladesh, of course, represents a reality where there is the dominant party state, that's true, in terms of the dominance part of it, but also in terms of the electorate as such. You can see that the plurality of the political base is also a factual reality, actually, which is why the dominant party is so fearful of giving meaningful elections. Because if the dominant party was completely confident of its developmental record, there would be little hesitation in allowing meaningful elections. Why is it not the case, actually? Because that the plurality of the electoral base, in fact, may have gone the other way around in terms of the disenchantment and all that. So I think this is one point I would really like to highlight, the need to be empirical in all of our analysis, economic, political, developmental. The other point I think is also, I want to sound a note of caution here in terms of, in a way, we are part of the elite here in this room. Certainly, Nomi, you are part of the international elite also. But in the sense that, the elites always have a upper hand in how the discourse is shaped. Generally, around the world, in Bangladesh too. So it's so important to be mindful that the formulations we try to develop does not have disempowering political consequences. For example, premature conclusion of the permanence of the dominant party state may actually send a negative signal to those other forces that Joe and Mushtaq mentioned about, and Akash also, who other sort of actors within society who may be trying to, in a way, push their own agenda, nothing more than that. So I think it is so important that the type of formulations that we do does not have that politically disempowering consequences. And here, for example, Mirza's ideas of the concentrating on the invited space, it flies into the face of the empirical reality. Just look at the Upazila election. Invited space. And the chaos there is very clear, actually, in terms of not just the absence of the competitors, but in terms of the intensity of the intra-party feuds. So what I'm saying is that to be content about really only addressing invited space, to me, is maybe a premature conclusion and maybe empirically not an appropriate conclusion. So I think the last point I would like to make is this the need to really unpack the framing approaches that we are, because I think as our friend from on the Indonesian case has said, the cases are so many different. Bangladesh, and I think Mushtaq has made it so many clear, the fact that the vertical disciplining power, right now the Upazila election is a classic example of the absence of this vertical disciplining power. Even the party chief has made an announcement that the non-sanctioned party candidates should withdraw, but they are merrily going on, and there is nothing being done about it. Of course, one can ask an additional question. Is it absence of discipline, or it's essentially, it's not really a great priority in that sense? So I think what we see is that Bangladesh certainly is suffering from democratic deficit, but I take, Joe's observation that in terms of even Mushtaq's point about good governance, a la Western concepts, etc. But democratic deficit in the sense of absence of meaningful contestation is a reality. There's no question, and this is a deficit. And that deficit is really created a understudied massive performance deficit. You look at institutional performance in the banking sector, in the share market, in the educational institutions, in the implementation of projects, the performance deficit is great. And is that a surprise, or is it a natural outcome in the way the political power, the dominant power has been organized? So I think let's approach lunch with a slightly more optimistic mindset that the chapter hasn't been closed. Bangladesh remains an open book in terms of what will happen. And let us all hope, and not just hope, let us also work together or work in our own ways so that the options within society, not the obvious ones, the latent ones, can also come to fruition. One last point I want to make, particularly for academics, which is understudied, I think, is the elite psychology. It is very important to study the elite psychology. And Bangladesh, is 50 years history. Bangladesh was dominantly characterized by what I would call a redistributive ethos. People were wary of flaunting their wealth. Not wary, socially inhibited in outright flaunting of their wealth. The elite psychology has gone a transition. That redistributive ethos has really weakened in a significant way. And we have a type of elite reveling in their wealth and not particularly bothered about the social despair in other quarters. Those are also like some of the challenges that we have. But as chair, I should not also abuse my own position to maximize time. We'll conclude here that Bangladesh remains an open book. The current dominant political configuration has inherent problems of sustainability, and there are windows where both appropriate framing and appropriate political initiatives need to get underway to try and build a better future. Thank you. That closes the session, and on to lunch.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.